So, when time seems to fly or drag, it's nothing to do with our internal clock speeding up or slowing down. It's how the brain processes time-related information that generates the illusion. Now, one particular phenomenon that fascinates psychologist David Eagleman at the University of Texas in Houston is that of so-called time dilation, when events in the outside world seem to be slowed down, almost frozen.
Well, many people report that when they get into a car accident, time seems to have gone in slow motion. They are sliding on ice towards the brick wall, and they see the whole event unfolding at a very slow rate. There are two hypotheses that could explain this. One of them is that something about the retrospective recollection of such a scary event makes it seem like it must have taken longer. The other possibility is that people actually have increased time resolution during the moment. So I thought for a while about how I could distinguish these two hypotheses. Initially, I took my lab to Astroworld, which is an amusement park here in Houston, and we went on the scariest roller coasters, and we tried a variety of time estimation experiments. So what we found is that even the scariest roller coasters didn't cause any illusions of time dilation. And I think the reason is one really needs to be scared for one's life. Something as scary as a roller coaster just doesn't do it. In fact, we ended up doing a lot of laughing that day. One really needs to be in an extreme situation in order to experience this time dilation. This is why we chose to do what's called SCAD diving, suspended catch air device diving, where you go to the top of a 150-foot tall tower and you are dropped like a rock, free fall, into a net 100 feet below. And people are doing this for fun, but it's extremely scary. The fall is about 3 seconds, and everybody that I interviewed reported that the fall seemed to last much longer than 3 seconds. So this seemed to be an ideal situation because there have been no injuries or fatalities with this sort of diving, and yet it really puts people in fear for their life.
So, in the interest of behavioral science, Dr. Eagleman found a subject willing, like him, to be scared out of his wits by doing some SCAD diving. To their wrists was strapped a special watch that ticked by flashing at a faster rate than one would normally be able to see. If, in a life-threatening situation, the diver's internal clock would speed up, generating the perception of slow motion, one would expect him to be able to read the rapid flashes.
Okay, so the first time we did this was a couple of months ago. I have a video of it here on the screen. So what you can see is that my graduate student, Chess Stetson, and I are ascending this tower in Dallas, and the tower is 150 feet high. So as you can see, we're going very high up in the air. The device, which is called the perceptual chronometer, or more colloquially we call it the eagle eye in the lab, it's strapped to Chess's forearm, and what I'm doing right now is setting the rate of presentation to a speed faster than Chess's brain would ever normally be able to read it. We pre-tested him on this. Okay, what I'm doing here is setting it. So here you can see Chess, and now being hovered over the net, and now he's released, and he's falling, and then he hits the net below. And you can hear Chess screaming here. So these are very preliminary results. Now what we found is that Chess appeared to be able to read the numbers at a rate that his brain normally would have never been able to. So we are gearing up to run 12 subjects on this later this month, and then we'll really know the answer, but the preliminary results seem very positive so far.
It seems then as if in these time dilation experiments, the internal clock may actually be speeding up when a person faces a potential catastrophe.
If this is true, that the brain can really speed up in a high adrenaline situation, it implies that the brain has a reserve capacity in the time domain where it can actually operate at a faster rate and take in more information per unit time than under normal circumstances. Now, one question is why the brain doesn't always run at this sort of speed, and the answer is generally that all animals run on batteries. So we have to conserve energy, and the general aim in the brain is to run things as slowly as you can get away with. So it seems like the sort of turbo boost in the brain is reserved only for extreme high-stress situations.
So far, we've been talking about the way our internal clocks function automatically and unconsciously outside our control. But Warren Mack and others are wondering whether we might deliberately tap into the mechanism in order to manipulate time.
Well, it becomes an interesting question as to whether this internal clock can be speeded up or slowed down. And there are numerous ways to do it. It's particularly interesting that those of us who drink coffee in the morning are essentially trying to speed up our internal clock to start the day off just right. There are many examples of where athletes use chewing tobacco and other forms of stimulants in order to increase the speed of their clock so that their time perception of when to kick the ball or swing a bat or to strike something is actually increased. And so it's very interesting to think about how the speed of this internal clock can be modulated with drugs, but also with various states of consciousness.
When Warren Mack talks about sportsmen and women wanting to slow down their perceived time, he's referring to the experience that squash player Mike Hall would describe as being in the zone.
The feeling I experience when I'm in the so-called zone is that I've actually stepped out of time and I'm completely, my body and my mind are actually totally in the moment. It's as if time has disappeared and I feel just there. When I'm playing squash, it's as if time around me is slowed down. And it's at the stage sometimes when I actually see the yellow dot on the squash ball in front of me, such as it's slowing down of time.
How might an athlete be able to get into that highly desirable zone when time seems to be tamed and skill heightened? Well, there's relatively little scientific research on that topic, but there is one idea, says Vincent Walsh, that might pay off.
There is one nice hypothesis which you might hope would be true, and that's that there's an optimum range of your heart rate. If your heart rate is somewhere between 120 and 145, you're in this kind of zone. But if your heart rate gets beyond that, and certainly beyond 175, you're beyond that zone, because you can't keep up with your own internal clocks, if you like, let alone keep up with the external world. But it's got a long way to go for that to have some scientific meat put on the bones, but it's too interesting not to try and put some meat on them.
Another line of research into our perception of time is that of brain chemistry. Now, the brain functions by producing communication chemicals called neurotransmitters that ebb and flow when and where they're needed.
We had known for a long time that the effects of marijuana are quite unique. And so any agent that produces unique pharmacological effects are frequently through specific mechanisms. And as far as brain substances are concerned, they're frequently through receptor mechanisms, a receptor acting like a light switch, if you will, and the drug is the trigger, and the drug activates that receptor, and then there's a whole cascade of chemical events. So obviously we have a lot of different effects of marijuana, and we think they're all mediated through this one receptor.
In general, you can think of the receptor systems in the brain as part of its communication circuitry. It's a bit like brain mail. One neuron sends a message in the form of a chemical neurotransmitter. The message floats around in the brain until it finds the particular kind of mailbox it's designed for, the receptor, and the message is delivered. The discovery of this receptor system really launched the field of cannabinoid research. Incredible progress was made, including the discovery in 1998 that the body produced its own natural cannabinoids, the neurotransmitters that marijuana was imitating. Since then, researchers like Dr. Martin have been working to discover what the natural system actually does. It's been a difficult task.
We don't really know what their physiological role is. Why are they there and what are they doing? We have, I think, some very educated guesses. What we're doing is we're actually looking back to marijuana, and then we know what marijuana does, and so we're assuming that the system it works on is involved in those same kinds of behaviors.
Dr. Martin's description of the function of the cannabinoid system might seem vague, but that's partly because the system itself seems to have lots of different functions. It seems to work like a kind of overarching governor affecting many other systems. As a result, it has an impact on all sorts of things: memory, motor control, pain sensation, but in subtle ways, as if it were fine-tuning the body's responses. This has been a fascinating discovery for researchers, since it's like nothing they've ever seen before.
Could we make a computer program that would test our relative consciousness at different times, after smoking, eating certain foods, ages, before flying planes, driving cars,